I received a text message that said, "I'm alive. Don't trust the children," just as the first handful of soil hit my husband's coffin. The words appeared on the scratch screen of my old phone in the middle of a windy morning at Street Bridget Cemetery. I froze. The smell of damp earth and sea salt mixed, cold and sharp in my nose. In front of me, the oak coffin had just been lowered into the grave, its shadow falling over my feet like an open wound. Those two words, "I'm alive," glowed small but fierce, as if someone had just ripped open the mourning veil covering my life. I couldn't hear the priest's voice anymore, only my own heartbeat pounding wildly and the waves crashing against the cliffs like drums announcing that something was about to shatter. Graham, my eldest son, adjusted his black tie and kept glancing at his watch. Miles, the younger one, bowed his head, but the corner of his mouth twitched a smile out of place. And Camille, Graham's wife, wore a hat with a black veil that covered half her face. Behind those dark glasses, I knew she hadn't shed a single tear. Everything was too fast, too cold, like a ceremony rehearsed for appearances rather than a real farewell. I clenched the phone in my hand, heart racing, wanting to throw it away, but the blue glow of the message clung to me like a pair of eyes staring through the mist. I typed back, each word trembling, "Who is this?" Less than 10 seconds later, the screen lit up again. "Can't say. They're watching. Don't trust the children." My fingers went numb. The wind swept through the graveyard, tangling my white veil around my neck until I could barely breathe. I looked up. My two sons were watching me. Graham smiled politely, stepped closer, placed a hand on my shoulder, and spoke in a smooth, measured tone. "You all right, Mom? I know today's been hard on you." His hand was warm, but the pressure of his fingers made me shiver. I nodded, hiding the phone inside my coat pocket, feeling as if I were concealing a ticking bomb in the middle of my husband's funeral. The man they said was gone, the man who woke early every morning to brew coffee, turn on the radio for the fisherman's news, and kiss my forehead before heading to the shipyard. That man, Thomas Hart, was said to have died in a compressor explosion. I remembered the call clearly. "We're sorry, Mrs. Hart. Your husband didn't make it." An explosion, an end. No witnesses, no report, only my two sons handling everything. They arranged the funeral in 3 days, saying, "Dad wanted it simple, nothing fancy." But no one from the Cedar Row shipyard, where Thomas had worked for 40 years, had been invited. No one even knew he was dead. And now, in the middle of his funeral, I received a message saying he was alive. I looked around. Street. Bridget Cemetery sat on a slope facing the sea, each gust carrying salt and seaweed through rows of gray headstones. Clouds hung low, the sky pale like a giant shroud. The ceremony was so quiet that I could hear the rustle of Bible pages and the scrape of the gravedigger's boots on gravel. Something was wrong. Every detail was too precise. Even the coffin looked cheaper than the one Thomas had said he wanted. I remembered asking Graham, "Why didn't you let me choose?" He had replied, "You're too upset, Mom. Let me take care of it quickly." I hadn't thought much of it then, but now every word, every look, every decision began clicking together into a frightening picture. I heard Camille whisper to Miles, "After the funeral, we need to talk about the house." Her voice was smooth, cold, as if she were discussing a property deal. Then I remembered, 2 months earlier, Graham had mentioned selling the old bay house, the one Thomas and I had lived in for 42 years. I thought he was just being practical, but now, in the gray light of the funeral, I saw something else in his eyes. Calculation. A faint light flickered from the phone in my pocket, making me flinch. I took it out, hands trembling. The last message was still there, but now there was also an audio file attached. I put in my earbuds, pretending to bow my head in prayer. Through the wind and waves, a voice came through Thomas's voice. Hoarse, low, hurried. "If you get this message, don't believe anything Graham or Miles tells you. Something happened at the yard. Don't let them near you. I love you." The recording cut off suddenly, leaving only heavy breathing and silence. I froze. No tears came. My mind spun. In the middle of the funeral for a man who might still be alive, I was the only one who knew, or at least the truth. I lifted my head. Graham was whispering something to Miles. Both their eyes flicked toward me, then away too quickly, but enough for me to notice. They knew I was starting to suspect. They could sense something had slipped from their control. I gripped my morning scarf tighter, forcing my heartbeat to steady. One question echoed in my mind. If Thomas was alive, then who was in that coffin? Or had he foreseen all this and left me in a survival game against my own flesh and blood? When the priest read the final words, "Let us bid farewell to the husband, father, and friend, Thomas Hart," I heard Camille murmur, "At least she won't be lonely anymore." A whisper soft as breath but colder than the sea wind. I looked down at my wedding hand, the gold band still stained with the shipyard's old, the kind Thomas never managed to wash off completely. I took a deep breath. The salt burned my lungs. "Don't trust the children." His voice echoed inside my head. When the gravedigger threw the first shovel of earth, the dry thud against the oak lid made me shudder. If I followed that message, it meant believing my husband had been harmed. And if that was true, then my 2 sons, whom I carried and raised, had done something unforgivable. I didn't know what the truth was yet. Only one thing was certain. From that moment on, I was no longer a widow. I was the only one left inside a colossal lie, and I would have to uncover the truth, even if it buried the rest of my life with it. I still remember the smell of the sea in those early mornings when we were the salty mist, the pine resin from the docks, and the burnt coffee Thomas always tried to make for me, never quite getting it right. 40 years of marriage, and that image has never left my mind. A tall, lean man with sun-bleached hair, hands always stained with engine oil, and eyes soft as autumn light over the water. When I first met Thomas in Maple Harbor, I was 27, and he had just opened a small shop called Cedar Row, fixing boats for local fishermen. He had nothing but a temporary shed, an old knife, and a pair of rough hands. Yet his gaze made me believe that life could begin again from the simplest things. Our wedding took place by the harbor, with the sound of gulls and the scent of toasted bread in the air. I wore a cotton dress I sewed myself, and we had only 2 witnesses, our neighbor and her 8-year-old niece holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Thomas promised, "I can't make you rich, but I'll give you a home and an honest life." I believed him, and I have never once regretted it. We lived in a 2-room wooden house, its walls old and its roof leaking every winter. I worked part-time as a seamstress in Mrs. Lorna's shop down the street, while Thomas rebuilt his workshop with his own hands. Those early years were hard, but small joys were enough. Every evening he would bring home a fragrant piece of wood, carve it into the shape of a fish, and engrave heart on its tail, so that when we have more, I'll hang it above our door, he said. When Graham was born, we were nearly exhausted. I sewed late into the night, and Thomas took extra shifts at the harbor repairing boats for the fishing crews. But I still remember how he held our firstborn in his arms, trembling, and said, "I'll never let our child go hungry." And he kept that promise at least for the first 30 years. When Miles was born 2 years later, things started to get better. Cedar Row earned a name for itself. People called Thomas the most honest boat repairman in the bay. He taught his sons how to use a saw, how to tell good wood from rot, how to listen to the waves to know when the rain was coming. But life changed faster than we expected. Graham, our eldest, was intelligent, confident, and ambitious. Even as a boy, he despised the workshop. "I'm not spending my life smelling like motor oil," he said when he was only 15. I remember Thomas just smiled, placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and said, "As long as you keep your hands clean and your heart straight, you can do anything you want." Miles was different, gentler, closer to his father. But as he grew up, he too was drawn to his brother's stories of city life, skyscrapers glowing at night, and money that came easier than sweat. The day Graham got accepted into a university in Boston, Thomas stood silently by the gate for a long time. "I'm happy, but also sad," he said. "When people step away from the sea, they never want to come back." I thought he was overthinking. I was wrong. In the years that followed, Graham rose quickly in his career and married Camelia, a city girl with cold eyes and hair that was always perfect. The first time she visited, she stood in our small living room, glanced at the wall filled with family photos, and said, "Oh, it's cute. A bit rustic, though." Thomas only smiled and poured her a cup of tea. But later he told me, "She looks at everything as if she's pricing it." Miles, though he finished college, refused to stay in Maple Harbor to help with the shop. He said, "Nobody builds wooden boats anymore, Dad. I'm going to work with money." Thomas only nodded. "Money's fine, as long as you don't become its slave." But they both forgot that. The phone calls grew fewer, and the visits turned into obligations. Graham spoke like he was in a meeting, quick, efficient, emotionless. Miles would only ask, "Do you need anything?" before hanging up in a rush. The house grew so quiet you could hear the clock tick. I began to fear the evenings, afraid of hearing the wind howl through the windows with no one to answer back. One day, Graham sent an email titled, "Your Future." Inside was a list of reasonable options: a seaside nursing home, a senior residence in Portland, and a house sale plan. I remember Thomas staying silent for a long time before saying, "Looks like our son already thinks we're dead." After that, he started keeping a journal. I didn't pay attention at first, only noticed him sitting alone in the workshop, the yellow light falling softly on his quiet face. I asked, "What are you writing?" He just smiled, writing down the things people forget. Perhaps in that notebook, he recorded things I never knew, small changes in how our sons spoke, how their eyes lingered on the house as if it were merchandise, how they discussed insurance, financial safety, and asset transfers. I still remember one winter night when the wind howled outside the porch. Thomas sat before the fireplace, holding a cup of tea. He looked at me, his eyes deep as the ocean, and said, "Do you see it, Evelyn? When money becomes the goal, family becomes just the road." I didn't know then that his words would become a warning for everything that came after, and that our simple love, once strong enough to build a life, would one day be destroyed by the cold greed of the very children we raised. I didn't realize when my family began to change. I only knew that one day, the dinner table that used to be filled with laughter turned into a meeting about money. Graham talked about stocks, Miles talked about real estate, and Camille talked about generational management and smart investments. Thomas, who could once talk for hours about cedarwood or the boats along the bay, sat in silence, his rough fingers tracing the worn silver wedding band on his calloused hand. "Dad," Graham said, "if you sign this new insurance package, the family will have another layer of security. No one wants risk at 70. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Are you worried about me? Or about the payout after I'm gone?" The question froze the air, leaving only the faint sound of cutlery tapping porcelain. Camille smiled, her voice smooth as honey. "Mr. Hart, I only want your parents to be safe. In Portland, everyone does it. The money won't be lost. It just becomes an asset." I said nothing, only looked at Thomas. He set his knife down, nodded slightly, and said, "If I need insurance, I'll buy it myself. But thank you for the concern." That night, after they left, Thomas pulled me out to the porch and whispered, "Graham doesn't look at me the same anymore. In his eyes now, there are only numbers." I stayed quiet. I knew he was hurting because to him, family was the one thing that could never be priced. But only a few weeks later, Graham came back, this time with a thick folder and a well-rehearsed smile. "Mom, Dad," he began, "we have to be realistic. This house is old, and the land is valuable. If we sell early, you can buy a smaller, more comfortable apartment. The rest I'll invest for you, make it grow." Thomas let out a dry laugh, brittle as rotten wood. "Grow for whom, Graham?" Miles chimed in. "I think he's right, Dad. We can't just live here forever, surrounded by rusty boats." I looked at my two sons, same blood, yet suddenly strangers. They talked about us as if we were items in an investment ledger. When Thomas refused, I saw Graham's jaw tighten, and Camille gently touched his hand, signaling him to stop. "It's fine," she said softly. "Let me talk to your mother." She sat beside me, her tone sweet. "You know, Mom, you could live at Maple Grove. There's a lake, a knitting club, and people your age. And this house, we'll take care of it for you. You deserve to rest now." I looked at her and calmly asked, "Do you know how many people in Maple Grove spend their first year there without a single visit from their children?" Camille chuckled lightly. "They're happy. They have comfort and friends. But here you're lonely, aren't you? I stayed silent, but inside it felt like a cold hand tightening around my chest. I couldn't understand what makes someone say such things to their husband's mother, right inside the house that man built with his own hands. After that day, the distance between us grew wider. The phone calls became about paperwork, and the visits turned into property inspections. I saw Graham walking around the workshop, jotting notes on his phone. I saw Miles sneaking a look inside the safe when he thought I wasn't watching. One morning, Thomas said, "I'm changing the locks on the shop." I asked why, and he simply replied, "Because I've started to fear the very people I taught to use the keys." That night, he pulled out his notebook and wrote something new. I saw the last line, "If something happens, check the signature." I didn't understand it then, but I only noticed his handwriting shaking more than usual. That same week, Graham called, saying Thomas should increase his insurance policy from $25,000 to $250,000 to cover occupational risks. He refused. A week later, someone from the insurance company came to our door with a new contract already signed with the name Thomas Hart. When I asked, Thomas stared at the paper for a long time, then said quietly, "That's not my signature." The words dropped into the air like a stone sinking into deep water. I remember that night, the yellow light falling across Thomas's face, tired but clear. He held my hand and said softly, "Evelyn, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of not knowing who's killing me little by little with my own trust." I looked out the window on the bay shore. Our two sons were still talking, Graham holding a stack of papers, Miles nodding repeatedly. The porch light cast its shadows long across the ground, overlapping, blurred, as if even their shadows no longer knew where the line between love and calculation was. The morning the accident happened, the sky over Maple Harbor was the color of tin, clouds hanging low over the sea. I remember it clearly because Thomas woke earlier than usual. He wore his old gray sweater, made coffee, and placed the cup in front of me. "Get some more sleep," he said gently. "I'm just checking the compressor today." I nodded, not knowing it would be the last time I ever heard his voice. Around 10 that morning, the phone rang. A strange man's voice, cold and urgent. "Mrs. Hart? There's been an explosion at the Cedar Row workshop. Your husband's been taken to Memorial Medical." I jumped to my feet, the cup slipping from my hand and shattering. When I arrived, the hospital corridor was lit with the cold glow of fluorescent lights. The nurse said he had chemical burns and head trauma, his condition critical. But what struck me as odd was that Graham and Miles were already there, Camille dressed neatly, as if they had been prepared. "How did you know your father had an accident?" I asked. Graham looked at me and smiled faintly. "A friend from town called me. Don't worry, Mom, I've taken care of everything." I was about to ask more when the doctor appeared, saying Thomas was in a deep coma and needed intensive care. "We're waiting for the blood test results," he said. "The injuries seem minor, but there's something unusual in his system." Before I could ask, Graham interrupted, "Don't bother Mom with the medical stuff. Just do your best." The way he said it made my skin crawl. That afternoon, when I went to see Thomas, he lay still under a white blanket, an IV running into his thin arm, his lips pale. I held his hand. His fingers still smelled faintly of pine resin. "Can you hear me?" I whispered. His hand twitched, just slightly, like a reflex. I looked up, ready to call the nurse, but she only said flatly, "It's a mechanical movement, ma'am. Don't get your hopes up." I stepped into the hallway, leaning against the wall. Graham was whispering to Miles, "If Dad pulls through, the life insurance becomes void. We need to be ready for either outcome." The words made me sick. When I turned around, they immediately switched tones. "Mom, go home and rest. The hospital paperwork's done." I looked into their eyes, cold, still, like water without ripples. That night I couldn't sleep. At 3 a.m. the phone rang. "Mrs. Hart?" the doctor said. "We're very sorry." His heart stopped at 2:47. No tears came. I just remember putting the phone down, staring into the darkness of the house like staring into the hollow of the sea. 3 days later, the funeral was arranged with suspicious precision. Graham said, "Dad didn't want anything elaborate." Miles added, "He hated crowds, so just family." but their definition of family didn't include the men from the workshop who had worked with Thomas for 40 years. When I asked, Graham simply replied, "Not necessary." Inside me, a vague unease began to stir, something that made my heart ache with every breath. Then strange things started to happen. 2 days after the funeral, I received an envelope from the bank. Confirmation of life insurance update $250,000. I froze. Thomas had always said he didn't need such a large policy. I turned the page. His signature was at the bottom, but the handwriting trembled, slanted, and unusually heavy. I took it to the local branch. The manager, a young woman named Lillian, glanced around before whispering, "I remember someone accompanied him that day. A middle-aged man looked a lot like your son." He said Mr. Hart's hands were shaking from illness, so he helped sign a few sections. I went numb. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I'm certain he was holding a coffee cup, trembling a lot." Coffee. I remembered that last morning Thomas was drinking a cup of coffee that Graham had brought over, saying, "I made it for you, Dad, the kind you like." That evening, I looked at the cup still sitting in the sink. A fine powder clung to the bottom with a strange smell, stronger and more bitter than regular coffee. I took it to a local lab, pretending to suspect mold. The technician, an old friend of Thomas's, frowned. "It's not mold. There are traces of methanol, industrial alcohol." I staggered outside. The first wind of the season hit my face like a slap. Only one question echoed in my mind. Who gave him that cup of coffee? When I got home, my 2 sons were sitting in the living room. Graham rested his hand on a stack of papers. "Mom, now that Dad's gone, we need to sort out the estate. The house, the workshop, the insurance'll handle it." I asked quietly, "Why so soon?" Miles answered without looking at me. "For safety, Mom. Old people make mistakes." I looked at them, and for the first time in my life, I saw it clearly. Between us, there was no longer love, only the cold emptiness of greed, and beneath that emptiness, the shadow of a crime waiting to be uncovered. I began to notice the things I had once chosen not to see. Small cracks in my son's stories, the details that didn't line up, the terrifying pauses when I asked the simplest questions. On the 3rd night after the funeral, I sat in Thomas's workshop, the pinewood room filled with the smell of paint and machine oil. Everything was unnaturally tidy. The desk he used to draw boat designs had been wiped spotless, no dust, no scattered papers. I opened the 2nd drawer on the right, where he usually kept insurance files, but found only a few utility bills. In the corner of the drawer lay a small scrap of paper with hurried handwriting. "If something happens, check the signature and the account." My hands trembled. "Which account?" I whispered to myself. Thomas had always kept just one joint account for us at Maple Harbor Bank, but the next morning I went to the bank. Lillian, the manager who had once mentioned the man accompanying Thomas, looked surprised. "Mrs. Hart, you're back? I thought the insurance matter was settled." I took a breath. "I need the last 3 months of statements for all accounts under the name Thomas Hart." She glanced at her screen, then frowned. "That's strange. Besides the joint account, your husband opened a secondary one 3 months ago, solely in his name. There have been several cash withdrawals." I leaned back in my chair. "How much?" "1,000, then 3,000, then 4. The last was a week before he passed." "Who withdrew it?" Mr. Hart signed. "But once he was accompanied by a young man. Brown hair, tall, said he was his son." I froze. "Graham?" She nodded, uneasy. "He said he was helping his father read the small print." I left the bank with a chill running down my spine. That afternoon my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Check the account. The money was transferred before he died." Don't trust them. I wanted to throw the phone away, but my hand stiffened. "Who is this?" I texted back. No reply. That night I searched through Thomas's old tin box where he kept important papers. Among the old documents, I found a brown envelope marked, "Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone." Inside was a handwritten letter. "I've realized Graham and Miles aren't the same anymore. They talk more about money than about family." They're pressuring me to sign the insurance, to sell the workshop. I think someone's influencing them, maybe Camille. If I die, don't believe a word they say. Remember, my morning coffee." I folded the letter, my heart pounding. The coffee cup Graham brought that day. Nausea rose in my throat. I turned on the light, grabbed my phone to call the police, then stopped cold. If Thomas was right, if our sons were involved, I needed proof. A mother's word alone would mean nothing. The next morning, I went to the Maple Harbor Police Department. Officer Callan, an older, kind man, looked up when he saw me. "Mrs. Hart, my condolences. What can I do for you?" I swallowed hard. "I'd like to see the report on the explosion at the Cedar Row workshop." He blinked. "Explosion? What explosion?" "My husband's. You said the compressor blew up." He flipped through his notebook, shaking his head. "There's no report of any explosion. No one reported one. If there had been, we'd have gone to the site." I froze. But the hospital said, "All we know is Mr. Hart was admitted for methanol poisoning." The room spun. I gripped the chair. "Poisoning?" "Yes, industrial alcohol. Highly toxic. Could be in food or mixed into a drink." I stood up, my voice shaking. "Who gave you that information?" "Your son signed the forms, requested confidentiality to protect your emotional state. He said you were too fragile to handle the details." I could barely breathe. They had lied to me. They had fabricated the explosion to cover up the truth. I left the station and stood under the fine thread-like rain, feeling as though the darkness was swallowing me whole. I drove straight to the workshop. The door was locked with a new padlock. I found Thomas's old spare key under the step. It turned easily. No sign of an explosion, no smoke damage, no broken machinery. Everything was intact, spotless, eerily clean. I walked around, heart pounding. On the workbench lay a crumpled piece of paper, scribbled in Thomas's handwriting. "Graham said I must sign quickly, said it was to protect you. But I sense something's wrong. If I die, find Stephen Callahan." Below it was a phone number. My hands trembled as I dialed. 3 rings. A calm, deep voice answered. "Stephen Callahan speaking." I whispered, "Who are you?" "My husband wrote your name in his note." He was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "Mrs. Hart, I'm the man your husband hired. He knew something was coming. We need to meet." I gripped the phone tighter, the cold spreading through my whole body. "Where?" "Harbor Street Cafe, 3 p.m. tomorrow. Sit at the back table. I'll bring the evidence." He hung up, leaving me alone in the workshop, where the smell of wood and oil now felt suffocating. I looked around the room Thomas had once called his heart, now nothing but the scene of a crime committed by those who shared our blood. That night I sat by the window, listening to the waves crashing outside, torn apart inside. How could I face the truth that my own sons might have murdered their father? But I knew when Thomas chose me as the keeper of his last secret, he believed I was strong enough to see it through. And for the first time in my life, fear turned into something else. Cold, steel determination. If they killed him for money, they would not live in peace with it. I promised myself, tomorrow I will walk into that cafe and begin the fight for justice for the man I loved and for the life we built together from nothing. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Maple Harbor was still wrapped in fog. Seagulls skimmed low over the water, their cries hoarse in the gray mist. I sat by the window, holding a cup of herbal tea that Thomas used to make every morning, feeling my heartbeat follow the slow rhythm of the waves. Today, I would meet the man who held my husband's final secret. I chose a pale blue wool dress and a long coat that Thomas used to say made me look like part of the sea. When I looked in the mirror, the eyes staring back were no longer those of a widow, but of someone about to fight. At 3 p.m, I walked into the cafe at the corner of Harbor Street. The bell over the door chimed softly. The place was small, filled with warm yellow light, and the scent of roasted coffee mingled with hot buttered bread. I took the back table, just as arranged. In front of me hung an old, darkened mirror reflecting the face of a woman who had lived through too many winters. 5 minutes later, a middle-aged man entered. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, wearing a brown coat, his eyes sharp but kind. He approached my table. "Mrs. Hart?" "Yes." "I'm Stephen Callahan." He pulled a thick file from his leather briefcase and set it on the table. "I used to be a private investigator in Seattle. Thomas hired me 3 weeks before he died. He suspected his sons were forcing him to sign fraudulent documents. I've gathered some things. You'll need to be prepared." I nodded slightly, my voice hoarse. "I've been ready since the day I buried him." Stephen opened the file and took out an old recorder. He pressed play, and Thomas's voice filled the air deep, steady, yet strained. "If you're hearing this, Stephen, it means I'm gone. Graham and Miles want me to increase my insurance. They said it's to protect Evelyn, but I looked closer, and the secondary beneficiaries are them. Yesterday, Graham asked how my coffee tasted and whether I'd been feeling dizzy. I'm worried. If something happens, find Evelyn. Don't trust them." My breath hitched. His voice was so real it made me want to reach through the machine and touch the air he once breathed. Stephen stopped the recording, giving me a moment to steady myself. He also asked me to install listening devices in the house, just to record suspicious conversations. I caught a few clips. "You need to hear them." He pressed play again. Graham's voice came first, cold and sure. "Methanol's odorless. Just a few drops. He'll think it's vitamins." Then Miles's voice, lower, nervous. "What about Mom? Once Dad's gone, she's weak. A little sleeping medication, people will think it's depression." I heard the clink of glasses, a small laugh right after discussing their father's death. My tears fell, but not from grief. They were the tears of someone seeing the true face of her own blood. "My God," I whispered. Stephen looked at me firmly. "You need to go to the police immediately. I have photos of Charles Graham buying methanol at a hardware store, paying cash under a false name. Receipts, camera footage, have everything." I nodded, then asked, "Why are you helping me?" "You could have walked away," he replied quietly. "Because Thomas said something I've never forgotten. I die. Don't let Evelyn believe it was her fault. I owe him that much." I couldn't hold back my tears. I clenched my hands, my voice rough but steady. "Then tonight we'll go to the police." He nodded. "I've spoken to Sergeant O'Connell. He's an honest man. But you must be careful. Your sons have filed for a psychological evaluation. They're trying to have you declared incompetent to control the estate." I froze. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, before the police can act." A chill ran down my spine. They hadn't just killed their father. They were planning to lock their mother in an asylum to make it all legal. Stephen looked directly at me. "If they show up tonight, don't open the door. I'll come pick you up, and we'll go together to submit the evidence." I nodded, clutching the file and hiding it under my coat. Before I stood, I asked softly, "If Thomas were alive, what do you think he'd say?" Stephen gave a sad smile. He'd say, "Evelyn, you've always been stronger than you think." When I stepped out of the cafe, the wind from the sea blew harder, carrying salt and chill through the air. The sunset sky bled violet, and for the first time in weeks, I felt my heart beating the heartbeat of someone alive, someone with purpose. I knew the road ahead would be long, but I also knew justice was no longer a dream. Tonight, I will bring the truth to the police. And tomorrow, the ones who betrayed their own blood would have to face the court and the spirit of the father they destroyed. When I returned home that night, the house on the Maple Harbor hillside carried a strange kind of stillness, as if even the wooden walls were holding their breath. The wind from the bay blew hard, making the curtains sway, and the grandfather clock on the wall struck 8 with a hollow sound. I placed Stephen's file on the table, staring at it as if it were a sleeping creature that held every piece of evidence that could save me, and just as easily destroy me if it fell into the wrong hands. Outside the window, the street lamp cast a faint golden glow over the empty road. I pulled my coat tighter, about to make tea, when I heard a car engine stop at the gate. A sleek black SUV, Graham's car. I froze, my heart pounding, remembering Stephen's warning, "If they come tonight, don't open the door." But their shadows already stretched across the porch. The knocking started sharply, impatiently, followed by Graham's voice, soft and syrupy. "Mom, it's me. Miles and I brought dinner." "You shouldn't be alone right now." I stayed silent. The door rattled under their hands and Miles's voice joined in. "Mom, please open up. We just want to talk." I turned toward the kitchen, glancing at the file. It was too visible. I hid it inside the cabinet under the sink, then went back to the living room. The door remained closed. "Mom," Graham continued, his tone lower now. "Doris said you met someone at a cafe this afternoon. Who was he? An older man, gray hair?" My chest tightened. How did they know? Stephen had been right. They were watching me. I forced my voice to stay calm. "Just an old friend of your father's." A short silence, then Graham laughed, sound stripped of all sweetness. "An old friend or an accomplice, Mom?" Miles added, "You're worrying people. We spoke to Dr. Albright. He says you're showing signs of psychological instability after the loss. We don't want you to hurt yourself." The phrase "hurt yourself" made me realize they weren't just after the estate. They were preparing to stage my suicide. I stepped back, keeping distance. "Go home," I said quietly. "It's late," Graham sighed, speaking like a father scolding a stubborn child. "Mom, don't pretend to be strong. I've already scheduled a meeting with the lawyer for tomorrow. You'll be moved to Brimley Senior Center. They have doctors there. You'll be comfortable." "A senior center?" I almost laughed, the sound breaking like glass. "You killed your father, and now you want to lock me away to cover the rest?" I heard a sharp inhale, as if Graham hadn't expected me to say it out loud. "Mom, don't say things you'll regret," Miles said, his tone tightening. "Dad died in an accident. Know that." "There was no explosion," I replied coldly. "The police confirmed it. They said he died from methanol poisoning." Silence outside. Then Graham's voice, trembling slightly. "Who told you that?" "Someone who knows more than you think." I heard Graham whisper something to Miles, then the sound of a key turning the lock using their copy. I backed toward the kitchen, grabbing the small knife from the counter. The door burst open. The hallway light cut across their faces that once made me proud, now hardened like stone. Graham stepped closer, speaking softly. "Mom, put the knife down. I don't want to make this worse." I tightened my grip, but my voice stayed calm. "Take one more step, and I'll scream. The whole town will know what you're doing." Miles murmured, "No one will hear you, Mom." The house is a mile from the main road. The chill that ran down my spine felt like ice. Graham moved closer, hands raised in mock reassurance. "We just want to talk, all right. Someone's manipulating you, making you think badly of your own sons." I met his eyes, my voice sharp as stone. "If that were true, you wouldn't have poisoned your father with the coffee you brought him." Graham's face went pale. Miles stepped back, whispering, "How does she know?" I cut him off. "Because your father knew before you did. He left proof of everything." For a second, the room froze. Then Graham lunged, trying to grab the knife, but just then, headlights flashed through the window. A police siren blared outside, piercing and loud. "Police! Open the door!" Both of them froze. I stepped back against the wall as Graham dropped the knife, shouting, "Who called the police?" "The man your father once trusted," I said, exhaling slowly. The door swung open as Sergeant O'Connell and 2 officers stormed in. "Freeze! Hands on your head!" Graham protested. "We were just worried about our mother." But Stephen entered right behind the officers, holding the file. His voice was cold. "And here's proof of how you worry about your recordings, photos, and receipts for methanol purchases," O'Connell signaled, and the officers handcuffed Graham and Miles. In the flashing red and blue lights, I watched my sons being led away, no longer my boys, but strangers trapped in their own greed. Stephen stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Evelyn. We have everything we need." I nodded, tears falling not of pain, but release. "No," I whispered. "It's only just beginning. Justice for Thomas is still halfway through, and I'll see it to the end." Right after my 2 sons were taken away that night, the house seemed to exhale a long, weary breath, but the air of calm that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of land after a storm, washed clean yet still cloaked in sadness. People tried to console me with polite words. "You did the right thing. The police will take care of everything. You should rest." But my heart, after so many sleepless nights, didn't know what rest meant. It was like a furnace that still glowed red, never going out. I used its warmth to keep myself standing. The next morning, the local paper ran a headline. Hart's two sons were arrested for the suspected poisoning of their father and attempted murder of their mother to seize property. The title screamed, "Killed his father for money, the tragedy of the Maple Harbor family." My picture appeared on the front page, eyes swollen, clutching the file like a reluctant heroine standing in the middle of ruin. Some called me brave, others whispered that I was cruel for exposing my own blood. Those words hit me differently. Comfort felt like medicine, judgment like a blade. But what I cared about most was not reputation, it was the truth, and the truth belonged in the light of justice. The police worked quickly. Stephen, with the composure of someone who had seen every kind of deceit, worked closely with Sergeant O'Connell. They gathered more evidence, receipts for methanol purchases, hardware store camera footage, withdrawal histories from the hidden account, and typed transcripts of the recordings. There was one moment I'll never forget when they played the tape inside the investigation room. Graham's voice echoed, cold and steady, as if reading coordinates. "Tomorrow I'll give him his new vitamin drink. Just a few drops." The room fell silent. I remember the faces of the townspeople turned away, others looked at me like an open book they couldn't bear to keep reading. In the weeks that followed, the investigation pulled us into corners of the family I'd never imagined existed. I discovered phone calls, emails, and secret meetings between Graham and loan sharks in the city. Debts unfolded like a dirty blanket, exposing the filth beneath. Miles, once the gentle one, had messages with a real estate broker discussing the speed of asset liquidation, and Camille Shea wasn't just the haughty woman I once knew. Through the evidence, she emerged as the orchestrator, the meticulous worker bee who soothed, arranged, and manipulated with chilling precision. Every morning I woke with a sense of duty. I was no longer someone waiting for answers. I was an active part of the investigation. I read and reread the reports, the blood samples, the medical records. The lab results were clear. Methanol was found in Thomas's blood at a lethal concentration, and residue in the coffee cup from our home matched the same substance. The forensic pathologists confirmed the symptoms, blindness, seizures, and neurological failure, consistent with methanol poisoning, not an engine explosion as the lie suggested. Hearing that, the grief inside me hardened into something else, a cold determination to bring those who summoned death into my home into the light. Preparing for trial was not simple. The courtroom was packed with reporters. Our small town suddenly became the focus of regional news. The prosecutors worked tirelessly, organizing testimonies, cross-checking evidence, and crafting questions to build the case. The defense attorneys for Graham and Miles tried to spin their story: financial stress, mental instability, a moment of weakness, phrases that might sound plausible to those who only skimmed the surface. But when confronted with the physical footage, the receipts, and most of all the voices on the recording, their arguments fell apart like thin paper. During the waiting days, the community was divided. Neighbors split into two camps: those who still visited, bringing food and flowers, and those who avoided me, perhaps afraid to be tainted by the story. Some called me the mother who turned on her sons, their tone carrying both pity and resentment. I understood them. Love is the most complicated thing. When it's betrayed, every value trembles. But for me, there was no choice but to move forward. Thomas had promised that the truth would be revealed. There were moments of loneliness that cut to the bone. One afternoon, I sat in our old armchair, gazing at the sea, and saw the shadows of my boys as they once were, children with flour on their hands, eyes bright as their father taught them to tie knots on a boat. I cried, not because I wanted the past back, but because I realized those children had been swallowed by something else: greed, despair, and coldness. I allowed myself to cry, and in those tears, there was release. I knew I couldn't save them from the path they had chosen, but I could stop them from hurting anyone else. Stephen stood beside me as an anchor. He wasn't just a detective, he was a friend, someone who shared meals and sleepless nights, combing through every scrap of paper with me. When he brought new evidence, a video of Graham paying cash and leaving the hardware store with a small bottle in his pocket, his eyes burned, but the first thing I asked was about Thomas. "Do you think my husband knew everything?" Stephen looked at me and said simply, "He saw it coming, and he prepared for it. He didn't let it end as just an accusation without proof." His words were like a thin layer of armor protecting me from the guilt of having ignored the signs too long. As the trial approached, the town fell into a strange quiet. People gathered outside the courthouse as if to watch a play no one wanted to see, whispering as though every house held a piece of the secret. I could feel their eyes when I walked down the street, filled with sympathy, others with awe. I wasn't seeking admiration. I wanted one thing only, for the truth to be recognized so Thomas could finally rest. The night before the trial, I went to the cemetery. The wind was sharper than usual. Thomas's grave held a new wreath from a local women's group. I knelt, touched the cold stone with trembling fingers, and whispered to the man I had shared a lifetime with, "You brought me here. I'll finish the road you began." The words were a promise not of anger or pleading, but of steady, quiet resolve. The next morning, as I stepped into the courtroom, I was no longer an empty mother. I carried my grief, but that grief had been forged into strength. I sat among strangers, facing my 2 sons in their orange prison uniforms, seeing them not through a mother's eyes but through the eyes of a citizen seeking justice. When the prosecutor placed the USB drive containing the recordings on the evidence table and asked if I could identify the voices, I answered without hesitation. "That's Graham's voice, that's Miles's voice, and that's Thomas's voice, man who believed the truth would prevail." The room grew heavy with breath, and in that moment, I understood. The battle wasn't over, but the path toward justice had finally begun its first solid step. The trial opened like a harsh play I never wanted to star in. Every corner of the courtroom was bare under cold lights, and the judge's gavel struck with the rhythm of a heart struggling to stay calm. I remember climbing the steps on trembling legs, clutching a small bag in which were a few old photos of Thomas and a slip of paper with his handwriting. I sat on the left bench, facing the 2 men who once called me Mother, now dressed in orange prison uniforms. The difference between them and me wasn't just the clothing, it was the distance between a love that had died and a justice still alive. The prosecutor entered with a grave expression. He presented each piece of evidence clearly: receipts for methanol purchases, hardware store footage, bank statements, and, tightening the air, the recordings. They played the first one, and in the dead silence of the room, Graham's voice cut through like a cold blade. "Tomorrow I'll put a little methanol in Dad's coffee. It'll taste like vitamins." I felt my heart being crushed, yet strangely the pain shattered into pieces that formed evidence, pieces that pointed toward truth. Key witnesses were called. Stephen Callahan recounted every step he had taken, how Thomas came to him, the carefully placed recorders, the moments he slipped in unnoticed when Graham and Miles thought they were safe. He showed printed transcripts, photographs of Graham leaving the hardware store with a small bottle in his pocket. As Stephen spoke, my eyes stayed fixed on him, a stranger who had become closer than anyone else in months. The forensic doctor took the stand and explained in clinical precision, leaving no room for doubt. Methanol, an industrial alcohol, causes blindness, seizures, brain damage, and death. Thomas's symptoms matched methanol poisoning exactly. When he gave his conclusion, a few people in the courtroom bowed their heads as if a fog had finally been torn away. I felt my heartbeat slow, and in that stillness came a quiet release, not joy but the affirmation that I hadn't been crazy all along. The defense tried to twist everything. They spoke of financial stress, of unclear intent, painting my sons as victims driven to desperation. They called the recordings potentially doctored evidence, and the bank records the complex finances of modern young men. But as the physical proof footage, the receipts, and most damningly, their own voices stacked up, every lie crumbled beneath the weight of truth. When it was my turn to testify, my knees nearly gave out. I walked to the stand, facing the very place where my sons once sat, spoon-feeding their sick child, now the seats of the accused. I spoke not shouting, not seeking revenge, but in a calm, steady voice about the days Thomas and I mended clothes together, watched the water from the porch, and believed in our sons. I told them about the notes Thomas left, his careful suspicions, and how he had tried to protect me even after he was gone. The cross-examination was cruel. "Can you prove those recordings are authentic? Are you certain your sons acted with intent to kill?" I looked at Graham, at Miles, and said clearly, "I heard them speak of it like a business transaction. They didn't grieve. They didn't count lost. They counted money. They discussed the steps to cover it up. They spoke of me as an obstacle. Those are not my sons anymore." In that moment, I realized I didn't need to convince the world. I only needed to stand firm in my truth. The trial dragged on for days, filled with testimonies, forensic details, and silences that left my throat dry. The townspeople debated at cafes and sent emotional letters to the courts, calling me a criminal, while others called me a hero. I learned to let their words pass through me. They were waves, arriving and receding. What I held on to was Thomas's face in my memory, and his words, "Never let the lie rest." When the jury returned with the verdict, the room seemed to stop breathing. I sat with my hands clasped, listening to each word. Defendants Graham Hayes and Miles Hayes, on the charge of premeditated murder. "We find you guilty." In that instant, sound dissolved around me. What I felt wasn't personal triumph, but a long exhale from an entire town reclaiming its sense of justice. Some people wept, some bowed their heads, and others simply brushed their hands together as if releasing a burden. I stayed silent, eyes stinging, but a slow peace rising within. The sentence was heavy. Long imprisonment, enough for the two who had once been my sons to spend their years confronting what they destroyed. As they were led away in handcuffs, I sat there thinking of the children who once played in the yard, of their goodbye kisses before school, and of the irreversible fracture that now defined us. I was sad in a way deeper than anger, but I did not hate. Hatred would only feed the same darkness they had lived in. I chose light instead. After the trial, my life didn't return to what it was, but it found a new rhythm. I transferred most of the insurance money once their motive into a fund for victims of family-related crimes. I remembered the day Ernest held my hand, breathing in the scent of cedar, saying he wanted our lives to mean something. I refused to let his blood turn into anyone's profit. The fund was small at first, grew slowly, helping women hire lawyers, pay for investigations, and find temporary refuge. When people came to me, hugging me, saying that because of me they'd found justice for their mothers or grandmothers, I felt a strange kind of joy. My pain had become a tool to save others. Time healed in its own way. I learned to walk past the streets where Thomas and I once strolled without shrinking inside. I planted flowers at the old workshop to forget, but to turn a painful memory into an act of life. Every Sunday morning, I bring fresh flowers to his grave, place them in the hands of the man I still call my husband, and tell him about the New Days Fund, the thank you letters, the blooming garden. People sometimes ask if I regret bringing my sons to justice. I answer honestly, there are nights when I cry for them, for the children who once sat on my lap, but I do not regret justice. Because if no one stands up, who will protect the victims? Who will say that money can never justify taking a life? I chose to stand with truth and with real love, the kind that refuses to kill for a bank account. Life goes on. I learned to cook new dishes, to tend the garden on summer afternoons, and to understand that compassion does not mean tolerating evil. For Thomas, I kept my promise to turn pain into purpose. For myself, I found freedom again, a freedom earned at a high price, but one worth paying. And every time the sea wind rises, I feel his hand in mine, gentle, not pleading, just making sure I haven't lost the path he showed me. After the verdict, the city of Maple Harbor seemed to take a long breath. News of the case's conclusion spread through neighboring towns, and I, the woman who had stayed silent all her life, suddenly became the center of interviews, articles, and endless conversations. I didn't read them all. Only when Sergeant O'Connell stopped by, handing me a copy of the final decision signed by the judge, did I sit down and truly exhale. "The case is officially closed, Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice low. From now on, they'll be where conscience can't be bribed. I smiled faintly, feeling neither victory nor defeat, only the stillness that comes after a long and weary journey. I returned to the house on the hillside, where the walls still carried the scent of Thomas's pine wood. The wind from the bay still blew across the porch, and the afternoon light still fell on the old photograph of Ushim in his work shirt, me in my blue dress, both smiling as if the world had never known betrayal. I stood there for a long time and whispered, "You see, Thomas, justice has come, but peace, perhaps, must be learned all over again." In the days that followed, the house slowly began to change its skin. I opened the windows each morning to let in the wind and the sound of waves. I repaired the old workshop, painted the walls white, and hung a small sign outside, "Heart Haven, a place to begin again." It was no longer a workshop, but a warm room for women who had been betrayed by their husbands or their own children and stripped of their trust. They came here, sat at Thomas's wooden table, told their stories through tears, and found their voices again after years of silence. I listened, took notes, and helped them connect with lawyers and support groups. One afternoon, an elderly woman with silver hair hugged me tightly and said, "If it weren't for you, I'd still think I had to stay silent just to keep the peace." I whispered back, "We don't stay silent to be loved. We speak so we can still be ourselves." Stephen kept his habit of visiting every week. He helped me manage the records, sometimes made coffee, always real coffee, never cheap blends or artificial flavors. Once, he said, Thomas would be proud. He always believed you'd turn grief into something good. I looked at him, smiling with quiet sadness. "I'm not sure about good, Stephen, but at least I didn't let it turn into hate." He nodded, and we both knew the truth. Some wounds never heal. You just learn how to live with them. A year passed fast and slow, depending on the day. The backyard bloomed with lavender and wild daisies. I held the first meeting for our Begin Again group, 8 women from different places, each carrying a different story, yet all sharing one thing: they had been forgotten. We sat in a circle around the fireplace, drinking herbal tea, speaking of sleepless nights, moments of despair, and the instant they chose to rise again. When one woman asked me, "Did you forgive your sons?" I stayed quiet for a long time, then answered softly, "I forgave the part of them that lives in me, so I could keep living. But I haven't forgotten the part of them that lives in him, because justice needs memory, not oblivion." The room went completely still, the only sound the wind whistling through the chimney. That evening, after everyone had left, I sat alone on the porch. The sunset stretched over the water, and in that moment I heard a familiar laugh in the wind, not real, just an echo from memory, but enough to soothe my heart. I imagined Thomas sitting beside me, his calloused hands holding a cup of coffee, his eyes gentle and tired. "Thomas," I whispered, "it's done now. I'm not angry anymore." Another morning, I received a letter from the state prison. The postmark read Graham. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it. The handwriting trembled, no longer proud. "Mom, I don't know where to start. I dreamed of Dad. He just looked at me and said nothing. Maybe he'll never forgive me, but I hope you will. If you can, please tell others that even small greed can destroy an entire life. I'm sorry." I folded the letter, tears falling onto the paper. Not tears of hatred, but of someone who had witnessed late repentance. I don't know if I can ever forgive completely, but inside me there was a sliver of light, small but real. When I stepped outside onto the porch, the sea was still proudly blue. I looked toward the horizon where the sun was rising, casting gold over the sign that read, "Heart Haven." In the morning light, those letters seemed to shine brighter, as if reminding me, justice doesn't end with a verdict, but with how we live after it. I sipped my tea, breathed in the lavender from the garden, and for the first time in years felt my heart grow light. If someone asked me who I am today, I would say, I am Evelyn Harthy, the woman who lost almost everything but found herself again. I've learned that justice isn't only in courtrooms but in everyday choices. Choosing honesty over fear, standing up instead of staying silent, choosing healing over revenge. And if Thomas were here, I believe he would nod, smile, and say what he always told me when I worried. We just need to live truthfully, Evelyn. Time will take care of the rest. I looked out at the sea, letting the wind carry away what was old. A new chapter had begun, not weighed down by the past, but steady with freedom. I whispered to myself, as a blessing, "It's never too late to begin again." The following spring, Maple Harbor came alive again. The houses along the bay wore fresh coats of paint, and the scent of new wood mixed with sea salt in the air. I still lived in the same old house, now a small haven for women who came seeking a new beginning. Heart Haven had found its rhythm. Every Wednesday we opened the doors to visitors, and every Sunday was story tea afternoon. I still remember the first evening after winter, when a young woman, barely past 30, walked in, bruises still visible on her face. She spoke softly, as if afraid of her own voice. "I heard your story on the radio. I want to believe I can start over too." I poured her tea, said nothing, and let silence do the healing. When night fell, I often sat by the window, looking out toward the bay. The old lighthouse's beam swept across the water, reflecting off the sign that read, "Heart Haven, a place to begin again," hanging out front. Sometimes Stephen still visited, bringing apple pie and bits of town gossip. "You know," he said one quiet evening, "the police say the Hart case is now used to train new investigators. They say it teaches them about trust, how it can save or destroy." I smiled faintly. "Trust isn't guilty. We just gave it to the wrong people." Stephen looked at me a little longer, his eyes warm but sad. "And you, Evelyn? Have you forgiven yourself?" I stayed silent. Forgiving is harder than any sentence. I used to believe that if I had paid closer attention, if I had asked Thomas one more time about his worries, maybe things would have been different. But I came to understand that guilt can't be erased, only transformed into something useful. So, I wrote. I rewrote my story not for the press, but for women who once thought silence was the only way to keep peace. Every night, I sat at Thomas's wooden table, the old leather notebook before me, and wrote as if talking to him. "I've done my best. I've kept living, just like you wanted." With every page, the tears came, but they weren't bitter anymore, light as mist. On the first page, I wrote the title, "A Place to Begin Again." Then one day, another letter came from prison, this time from Miles. The letter was short, the handwriting small and careful, as if weighed word by word. "Mom, I don't hate Dad anymore. I understand now that what I wanted wasn't money but recognition. I always thought I lived in Graham's shadow, and I was weak enough to follow him. These days, every morning in the yard I watch the sun rise through the fences. I think of you and wish I'd been brave enough to live simply. If I ever get out, I want to help you at Heart Haven if you'll let me." I read the letter in the morning light, my hands trembling, my heart heavy yet calm. I didn't answer right away, but I placed his letter beside Graham's, and for the first time in many months, I lit 2 candles, one for each son. By the end of spring, I decided to expand Heart Haven. The old workshop in the back was turned into a reading room and a small office. I hung Thomas's picture on the wall, beneath a brass plaque that read, "In memory of Thomas Hart, whose truth set us free." Whenever someone asked, I simply said, "He's the reason I still believe in people, even when people can betray." We hosted workshops where everyone wrote down the one thing they most wanted to forgive. One afternoon, as we read the notes aloud, I came across a line that brought me to tears. "I want to forgive myself for living too long in fear." In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. Stephen told me I should publish my story. I hesitated. He said, "Not for fame, but because there are people who will listen to you when they can't listen to anyone else." So I kept writing, steadily, night after night, until the manuscript was done. The local publisher printed the first 100 copies. On the last page, I wrote the dedication. "For Thomas, who taught me that justice begins with courage." When the book came out, I didn't expect anyone to read it. But then letters and messages began to arrive from nearby, some from cities I'd never been to. People wrote that my story gave them the strength to press charges against abusive husbands, to tell their children they had limits too. One woman wrote, "Thank you for helping us believe that 60 is not the end." I read them and realized sometimes, simply surviving can be its own form of inspiration. One May afternoon, I walked along the shore where Thomas used to launch his boats. The water shimmered like glass, and the sky was so clear it felt like you could see straight into your own heart. I stood there, eyes closed, letting the wind carry the scent of salt and pine, listening to the whisper of time. I understood then that life doesn't give us perfect endings, but if we are brave enough to live through our losses, it gives us something rarer than justice and peace. That night, I wrote the final line of my second book. Happiness doesn't come from who stays, but from when we learn we no longer need them. I signed my name, set down the pen, and looked out the window where the moonlight glimmered across the sea. A year after the storm, I was no longer the woman who trembled through sleepless nights. I was Evelyn Hart, who walked through fire and found, in her own ashes, a new beginning. And if anyone asks me, "Are you truly at peace?" I'll smile. Peace isn't the absence of pain. It's knowing how to look at your pain and still choose to move forward, soft as the wind on the water, strong as the old lighthouse light that keeps shining, even when the night surrounds it. 1 year after the book A Place to Begin Again was published, Hearthaven had grown into something far greater than I ever imagined. Women from everywhere came to Maple Harbor, each bringing her own story, rejected by their children, some widowed in silence, some who thought their lives were nothing more than days repeating inside loneliness. They came, sat around Thomas's old oak table, drank tea, and spoke about things that seemed small but were really entire lives. Fear, endurance, apologies that were never said. I listened and saw in each of them a part of who I once was, the woman who believed sacrifice would be rewarded with love until she learned that kindness saves no one if you don't first learn to save yourself. That summer, the town held a ceremony honoring those who had contributed to the community. The mayor sent an invitation with a handwritten note, "Mrs. Evelyn, Hearthaven has changed more lives than you know." I hesitated. I never liked stages, nor did I believe courage could be measured by applause. But Stephen said, "Sometimes people need to see someone who has survived, not to praise them but to believe they can too." So I went. The ceremony took place outdoors, in the park by the bay. The afternoon light was golden, and the wind carried the scent of lavender from the flower beds I'd once helped plant. When the host called my name, I walked up onto the wooden stage as applause rippled across the grass. I stood there, in my cream-colored dress, looking down at faces both strange and familiar of the women who had once wept in my small room, now smiling, radiant. I spoke slowly, each word deliberate. I used to think justice happened only in courtrooms. Now I know it also happens when a woman dares to say enough, when she chooses to live, even as everything around her falls apart. The park fell silent. Then applause rose again, long and warm, wrapping around the amber sky. That night I sat on the porch as moonlight spread across the still sea. Stephen came out and handed me a small letter. "From the prison," he said softly. "They asked me to deliver it." I recognized the handwriting, Graham. I opened it and read carefully. "Mom, today I heard about the ceremony. I saw your picture in the paper and you were smiling. I don't know if you've forgiven me, but I want you to know this. I told the men in here about Hearthaven, about how you turned pain into hope. They call you the sower. Some said that when they're released, they'll find you not to ask for help, but to learn how to start again. I think maybe Dad would smile too. I'm sorry for everything." I set the letter on the table, tears falling and soaking the paper's edge. Stephen sat quietly beside me. He would smile, he said softly. I looked up at the sky full of stars, and for the first time in years, I believed that. Life went on, but I no longer counted the days by sorrow. I planted more lavender along the path, taught the women at Hearthaven how to tend flowers, how to bake, and how to sit still without feeling guilty for resting. One September afternoon, a girl of about 16 came with her mother. When I asked why, she said, "I read your book online. I just wanted to tell you, you made me stop being afraid of growing old." I laughed a real laugh. Not because I felt younger, but because I finally understood that even stories born from suffering could bloom into seeds for others. That night, I took out Thomas's old notebook and opened it to the first page. His handwriting was still there. "If anything happens, check the signature." Beneath it, I added a line of my own. If anything happens, check the heart knows the way. I closed the notebook, set it on the table, and looked around the candlelit room. On the wall, Thomas's photo smiled down, and below it hung a painting given by a woman from our group, Lighthouse in a Storm, its light stretching upward, brilliant. I realized then that Heart Haven wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of what we were all searching for, a safe place to begin again, even when the world outside refused to change. Then one winter morning, as I stepped onto the porch, snow was falling gently like silver dust. The sea was calm, only soft waves murmuring. I made tea, set out 2 cups, one for me, one for Thomas. Steam rose, curling into the cold air. I whispered, "Thomas, I kept my promise." In that moment, I didn't feel alone. I felt a circle closing only to open into a new beginning. Outside, the sun slowly rose, casting warm gold through the window onto the brass plaque by the door. Heart Haven, a place to begin again. The letters glimmered in the morning mist, like a promise rewritten each day that no matter your age, no matter your loss, you can live again, love again, and believe again. I lifted my cup, breathed in the scent of lavender, and smiled. Perhaps that is the final form of justice, not punishment, but living peacefully in the light after walking through every darkness. And if you're hearing my story now, I want to ask, where are you beginning again? Tell me, and remember it's never too late to live the life you deserve.